So, in case you didn't know, I run a YouTube channel that largely centers on A Song of Ice and Fire. As such, I often get the question, when is The Winds of Winter coming out? Is 2025 the year? Is there any hope that we can find some sort of happiness in this year? Well, the short answer is no, but the long answer is we can look at George R.R. Martin's behavior in the past and see if any of his contemporary actions can give us hope. And so let's go back in time and talk about the publication of his previous book, A Dance with Dragons. So I'd like to go over how A Dance with Dragons came together. As many of you know, A Dance with Dragons and A Feast for Crows were once planned to be a single book. But as the novel grew and deadlines passed, George and his publishers decided to split the book in May of 2005. A Feast for Crows is then published in October of 2005. Actually, the split is a bit more complicated than that. It probably wasn't just a length issue. George had a number of plot-related roadblocks he was dealing with. But regardless, the books were split, which means that some dance material was being worked on as early as 2001, namely some Jon, Dany, and Tyrion chapters. Anyway, after the split, George focuses on Feast. It gets published, he goes on a promotion tour, and he doesn't get back to writing Dance until January of 2006. In fact, George writes a whole blog post about this. So if one asks, when did George start on A Dance with Dragons, we have two answers. In one sense, he started A Dance with Dragons in 2001 after the publication of A Storm of Swords. But also, in a way, George started writing A Dance with Dragons in 2006 after the publication of A Feast for Crows with a big head start. And we're going to mainly focus on this second idea, the 2006 onward to 2011. George began in January 2006 with a big head start. Now, George eventually tells us how many pages he had at this point. 542 manuscript pages of a book that would eventually be 1,510 pages. And so this was his starting point, about 1/3 done. Of course, at the time he actually thought he was half done, as he didn't expect Dance to be so long. Thus the whole "see you next year" claim in A Feast for Crows. Whatever the case, George begins writing again, and, well, it doesn't go well. At least not at first. From January 2006 to about October 2007, he just writes very little. In fact, he gives us some numbers on where he was in October of 2007, and it was 472 pages. That's right, after almost 2 years, his page count actually went down through rewrites and edits. Then things creep along in 2008 and 2009, where George gets to 1,038 pages at the beginning of 2010. The second third completed. Now, I say creep, but we would actually kill for progress like this today. 250 pages a year? That's a 1,500 page book every 6 years. The Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring would have been completed 2 years ago if George wrote at that pace. Alas, back to the story. Anyway, in early 2010, something amazing happens. George gets into a groove, and his page count fucking explodes. He writes like a maniac in 2010 and the early part of 2011. It is a baller year and some change, where he writes over 500 pages. And so, breaking this all down very simplistically, A Dance with Dragons had roughly the following history. Starting in 2006, he had about a third, 500 pages left over from Feast. 2006 to 2007 is the stalled period, where he had not much progress. 2008 to 2009, he had slow progress, where the second third was completed. And then 2010 was the baller year, where the final 1/3 was completed. Again, this is the very simple telling of the story. There's plenty of detail we can get into. In fact, let's do just that. No time like the present. I'm sure many of you would like to know what caused George to stall and get in his ruts, and what got him out of those ruts. Well, to understand the stall, we must keep in mind what preceded it. The split. In fact, these are actually the same problem. Certain parts of the story got George stuck, and 2 years without any forward progress is actually understating the issue. These same story beats had little to no progress years before the stall. And so what specifically were the problems, and how did George solve them? Well, as it turns out, George has told us what the problems were. They were Jon, Tyrion, and Dany. And thanks to superfan G-Steph going to the Cushing Library and examining previous drafts of A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, we actually know that the early Jon, Tyrion, and Dany chapters are the oldest A Dance with Dragons chapters that were written. Later on, I'll give you a breakdown on this. George started with Jon, Tyrion, and Dany before any of the other chapters that appear in A Dance with Dragons. I mean, it is expected as they seem to be the main characters, but then he hits a wall around 2003 to 2004, where the stories of Jon, Tyrion, and Dany essentially freeze in place. And this is simply not the case with any of the other point of views. They all flowed relatively easily. What I'm saying is that the problems with A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, what took so long for the books to come out, why there was a split, were there from the beginning, Jon, Tyrion, and Dany, and it took a good decade for it to eventually resolve. So, specifically, what was George hung up on? Well, with Jon, we know that George wrote Jon 1 and 3 first. Jon 1 is the introduction, and Jon talks to Stannis, and Jon 3 is Mance's execution. Eventually, Jon 3 grows, and George broke it into two pieces, Jon 3 and Jon 4, Jon 4 being where Jon talks to Stannis about battle planning. And then George wrote Jon 6, the Rattleshirt fight in the yard, and then George went back and wrote Jon 2, that's the Samwell 1 mirror chapter. Now, George straight up tells us in March of 2006, that is, in the stalled period, that he's having trouble with Jon and is unhappy with the first 5 Jon chapters. That is, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. Jon 5 doesn't exist yet. George tells us, for the last week or so, I've been back at the wall with Jon Snow and the men of the Night's Watch. Jon, I think, will be one of the main beneficiaries of my splitting A Feast for Crows in two. I will have more room to deal with Jon and Stannis and the wildlings and the rest, which will allow me to flesh out their storylines more and bring them to a better resolution. Now, I will say, those early Jon chapters deal pretty heavily with Jon and Stannis. Stannis doesn't really need to be fleshed out too much. But the point is taken that George feels like there needs to be more time with the wildlings. Now, I will say, based on G-Steph's analysis of those early Jon drafts before the split, the story plot-wise didn't change that much. In the early drafts, there was a planned ranging to Craster's Keep and to find Tormund. There's more focus on getting the Night Fort operational, and Mel wants to burn Mance's son to wake dragons, and some other weird visions happen. But for the most part, the plot of the early Jon chapters stays the same, and George's edits are mainly about the material being reorganized and wordsmithed. It seems that the issue with the early Jon chapters, and where he got stuck, is that Stannis leaves the story, and now the wildlings need to enter the story for Jon to interact with them, and George didn't know how to do that. In fact, we are fairly certain that George stays stuck on Jon for a long period of time. Again, Jon 6 was written in late 2003, and the next chapter in the Wall story is the Melisandre chapter, which George doesn't write until April of 2008. George was stuck on Jon for nearly 5 years. So what breaks George out of his rut on Jon? Well, we do get a new point of view character, Melisandre, in 2008, and the Jon story eventually grows to 13 chapters, 14 if you include Mel. And so I'd like to highlight these two mechanisms that George uses to get out of a rut. First, he uses new points of view, in this case Melisandre, and second, he uses a large quantity of material, in this case 9 more chapters. And by the way, here's a quick summary of those chapters. Jon 5, he brings food to the wildlings at Molestown. In the Melisandre chapter, he sends Mance to the wedding. In Jon 7, Jon ranges north of the wall to find wildlings, corpses, and giants. In Jon 8, he sends off Val and hears about Hardhome. In Jon 9, Selyse, Tycho Nestoris, and Alys Karstark all arrive. And in Jon 10, we have Alys Karstark's wedding. Very late in the writing of A Dance with Dragons during the boom period, George writes Jon 11, 12, and 13. Which is Tormund and the wildlings crossing at the wall. Now, there isn't anything particularly wrong about those middle Jon chapters. They're very well written chapters, but I do question how necessary they were. The Jon story absolutely needs Stannis and Mance at its beginning, and it absolutely needs Tormund at its end. They are rather integral to the plot, but can the same be said of food riots, or Jon's ranging, or Alys Karstark's wedding? Some of these chapters could be deleted with little to no change to the plot. And so now let's talk about George's problems with Tyrion. So from what we can tell, George writes the first 5 Tyrion chapters, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then runs into problems around the time of the Shy Maid and Tyrion meeting young Griff. We know that Tyrion 1 is written sometime in the year 2001, Tyrion 2 and 3, which were originally one chapter and then split, in 2002, and Tyrion 4 sometime in 2003. And he has Tyrion 5 at least partially written in 2004. Though it should be noted that George does go back and revises these chapters a bit. Not in any major plot way, but there is wordsmithing and cutting of lore. Now regarding challenges around this period, we firstly know that Tyrion is a darker character in A Dance with Dragons, being a murderer and a rapist, and George specifically says it was difficult writing him at this point. Second, based on G. Steph's analysis of these early chapters, we know that George was unsure how much Blackfyre and Volantis lore he wanted to include in the story. He later cuts a bunch. But the biggest sticking points seem to be the Shrouded Lord and Tyrion's arrival in Volantis. In October of 2007, George writes, "Dance with Dragons? Yes, working on that too. Lately it's been Tyrion and more Tyrion. When I finish these 3 chapters, I will need to double back to pick up some of the other point of views, lest my devious dwarf get too far ahead." So George says he was working on 3 Tyrion chapters, but in fact we find out he had been working on 4. In the comments he writes, "Someday I will die, and I hope you're right and it's 30 years from now. When that happens, maybe my heirs will decide to publish a book of fragments and deleted chapters, and you'll get to read all about Tyrion's meeting with the Shrouded Lord. It's a swell, spooky, evocative chapter. But you won't read it and dance." So that's rather interesting. During the stalled period, George wrote an entire chapter where Tyrion meets the Shrouded Lord. Perhaps it's in a dream, perhaps it's not, and George simply cuts the chapter. Considering that the Shrouded Lord is mostly talked about in Tyrion 5, and this is the chapter where Tyrion goes overboard, we can surmise that the chapter was probably between Tyrion 5 and 6. But this wasn't the only problem that George was having. A few months later, George writes, "Finished a Tyrion chapter yesterday, one I've been struggling with for months. Made a major change to the end of the chapter. One I think works much better than what I had before. Also tackled another Tyrion chapter that had been giving me trouble, mainly by ripping Tyrion out of the scene entirely and rewriting the whole damn thing from another point of view. Not quite done with that one yet, but I think it'll work better as well." So here George is clearly talking about Tyrion's arrival in Volantis and the Lost Lord chapter. Originally that chapter was a Tyrion chapter, and he rewrote it from John Connington's point of view. It's a pretty revolutionary change in the story, all things considered, but as you can see in the timeline, it did end George's stalled period and begin his slow period. So we are fairly certain that George creeped along on this Shy Maid story for Tyrion for a good deal of time. Tyrion 5 was at least partially written in 2004, and the Shrouded Lord problem and the Lost Lord problem weren't worked out until late 2007. George actually describes being stuck on 3 Tyrion chapters simultaneously in late 2007. The Shrouded Lord chapter had already been deleted, so it seems the 3 chapters are most likely Tyrion 6, the Lost Lord, and Tyrion 7. George also says that he wants to take a break from Tyrion at this point so that the other characters can catch up, and Tyrion 7 is a very fitting point to do that. And so what finally broke George R.R. Martin out of his Tyrion rut? Well, again, we get a new point of view character, Jon Connington, and the Tyrion story eventually grows to 12 chapters, 13 if you count the Lost Lord. And so we are seeing the same mechanisms to get out of the rut. A new point of view, Jon Con, and a large quantity of material. And quickly, here's a summary of the Tyrion story to move the plot forward. Tyrion 6, Tyrion plays Syvass with Cavo and gets captured. The Lost Lord chapter, the Golden Company is introduced. Tyrion 7, Tyrion comes to Volantis and meets the Widow of the Waterfront. Tyrion 8, he's on the Celsori Quran. Tyrion 9, he's on the Celsori Quran. Tyrion 10, Tyrion is sold into slavery. Tyrion 11, he escapes slavery to the Second Sons. And Tyrion 12, he signs papers to join the company. Now again, these chapters are finally written, and unlike with the Jon plot points, I do think the Tyrion plot points are mostly necessary. But I do question the sheer length of these chapters. Tyrion 7 is exceptionally long and bloated, being the longest chapter in A Dance with Dragons and the 3rd longest chapter in all of Ice and Fire, and it's mostly him walking around a city. Tyrion 6 is the 4th longest chapter in A Dance with Dragons, and there are 2 chapters on the Celsori Quran. It's difficult to argue that much of this material could not have been trimmed. Whatever the case, dealing with the problems of Jon and Tyrion did pull George out of his stagnation period. But he wasn't yet to the boom period. Which brings us to the Dany issue. So the Dany problems are a bit more famous, with fans hearing about the so-called Myronese knot. What is the Myronese knot? Well, according to George, it was a confluence of many, many factors. Let's start with the offer from Xaro to give Dany ships, the refusal of which then leads to Qarth's declaration of war. Then there's the marriage of Daenerys to pacify the city. Then there's the arrival of the Yunkish army at the gates of Meereen. There's the order of arrival of various people going her way. Tyrion, Quentyn, Victarion, Aegon, Marwyn, etc. And then there's Daario, this dangerous sellsword, and the question of whether Dany really wants him or not. There's the plague, there's Drogon's return to Meereen. All of these things were balls I had thrown up into the air, and they're all linked and chronologically entwined. The return of Drogon to the city was something I explored as happening at different times. For example, I wrote 3 different versions of Quentyn's arrival at Meereen. One where he arrived long before Dany's marriage, one where he arrived much later, and one where he arrived just the day before the marriage, which is how it ended up being in the novel. And I had to write all 3 versions to be able to compare and see how these different arrival points affected the stories of the other characters, including the story of a character who actually hasn't arrived yet. Going back and looking at the early drafts, we can see that George had a massive restructuring of the Dany story. According to George, the first chapter he wrote back in 2001 to open the Dany story was Daenerys 9, Daznak's Pit. Then he wrote Daenerys 1, an intro, and Daenerys 3, where Xaro arrives, in 2003, though Daenerys 3 would happen after Daznak's Pit. Then George writes Daenerys 5 and parts of Daenerys 6 in 2004, that is, the chapter where the Qarthian ships arrive and then the Astapori refugees. And then by 2005, Daenerys 3 has been expanded and broken into Daenerys 2 and Daenerys 3 and moved before Daznak's Pit. But as George moves material around, it's difficult to tell which chapter is which. Now what's very interesting about Daenerys 2 and 3 is that these chapters were actually distributed at a book expo on June 4th, 2005. That is, the 2005 Book Expo of America in New York City. And remember that George and his publisher officially split the book on May 29th, 2005. His publisher being Bantam Books of New York City. The point being, it seems that in the months leading up to his meeting with his publisher, George had been working on the Dany story. And on that same trip to New York City where he was going to meet that publisher, he was distributing Dany material. It seems rather likely that the messy reorganization of the Daenerys story was specifically on our author's mind when he decided to split the books. And from what we can tell, George is stuck on Dany the longest. Dany 5 and 6 are written sometime in 2004, but then in May 2006, George mentions that he's writing the first Quentyn chapter, The Merchant's Man. This is relevant as in April of 2007, George writes Dany 7, that is her wedding, which is also the same chapter that Quentyn arrives in Meereen. And then in February of 2009, George expresses frustration with writing and mentions that he's writing from Quentyn's point of view again, that is the Windblown chapter. George is now messing around with the order of when Quentyn arrives. But as the Dany story is shifted around so much with its order, pieces of one chapter move to another chapter, it's really difficult to know what was written when. What we do know is that George spends a great deal of time in 2009 frustrated with the Myronese knot. In June he writes, "Now if I can only slash through the Myronese knot that I've been worrying about since 2005. In July he writes, "Still tugging, slashing, and cursing that Myronese knot." In September he writes, "Taking another whack at the Myronese knot today. I'm going to try breaking 2 largest chapters into 4 smallish ones, changing the order of events somewhat, and weaving them all together. Maybe that will work a little better." Timeline-wise and plot-wise, George is almost certainly talking about Daenerys 9 and breaking off Daenerys 8 from it, as well as breaking the Spurned Suitor and the Dragon Tamer apart. No other chapters happen so close together, and no other chapters can be described as smallish. Keep in mind, at this point it seems that George was planning for Quentyn to steal dragons around the time of Daznak's Pit. But George remains frustrated, writing a week later, "I decided to take a break from tearing and fumbling at the Myronese knot, and completed a chapter about another character today." A month later, he writes that he's thinking about going back to Meereen, but then decides against it. George R.R. Martin is still in his Dany rut. So what breaks him out of it? Well, in January of 2010, he writes, "Of course, I'm writing about Meereen, where the weather is hot and muggy. Oppressive. If the snow keeps falling, I better take it as an omen. Switch to a Jon chapter tomorrow. The good news? Finished a chapter today. The bad news? It's one I've finished at least 4 times before. This time, though, I think I finally got it right. We'll see. Still whacking at the Meereenese knot. I took an especially vigorous hack 2 days ago by switching to a new POV. It seems to have helped. Helps to have a pair of eyes on the inside rather than the outside here. And backstory works better in recollections than in dialogue." That's right, George has added yet another point of view. This time, it's Barristan. And the Dany story swelled to 10 chapters, 14 if you add Barristan's chapters, and 18 if you add Quentyn's. By the way, it's up in the air whether Quentyn was also a crutch for the Dany story. He's added as a POV sometime after the A Feast for Crows, A Dance with Dragons split. Now, I happen to really like the Daenerys story and all its complexity, but we should remember that originally the first chapter was Daenerys 9, Daznak's Pit, with Daenerys 1 and Daenerys 3 added shortly after. The coming war had been established, and Daenerys' eventual flight had been established. And so I do have to ask if every element in Meereen was necessary. Did we need the refugees? Did we need the Pale Mare? Did we need the Green Grace and the Pit Fighters and the Yunkish Meddling and the many sellsword companies? In the end, we can see that Jon, Tyrion, and Dany were big problems, but I'd like to focus again on the scale of these problems. The Jon story in A Dance with Dragons is roughly 74,000 words, and 80,000 if we include Mel. And the Tyrion story is 73,000 words, 79,000 if we include The Lost Lord. And the Dany story is 58,000 words, 79,000 if we include Barristan. Altogether, that's 238,000 words, or 57% of A Dance with Dragons, which was 415,000 words. And A Dance with Dragons is huge. Jon, Tyrion, and Dany would be 80% of a book the size of A Feast for Crows. The size George originally wanted A Dance with Dragons to be. And we're not even including Quentyn. Essentially, the problem with A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, the thing that caused the split, the thing that caused the delays, became a book in and of itself. In a sense, A Dance with Dragons is the problem of the split and the delay. Jon, Tyrion, and Dany, bloated and meandering with too many POVs in search of an ending. Now you might say that Jon, Tyrion, and Dany's stories are huge, but they're the main characters. Except that we kind of only say that in retrospect. Jon, Tyrion, and Dany in many ways became the main characters because of A Dance with Dragons and the problems with it. Dany, for example, has very few chapters in A Clash of Kings, just 5, and Jon had 8, half as many as in Dance. And when it comes down to it, our author didn't originally envision Jon, Tyrion, and Dany having such a huge presence at this point in the series. Back in February of 2005, that is just 3 months before the split, George reported to fans that he was almost done with A Feast for Crows, with about 1,300 pages. He just needed to write the ending, he claimed. And again, we know exactly where he was at this point. Jon 5, Tyrion 5, Dany 6 or 9, depending how you define it. Jon is at the wall waiting for Tormund. Tyrion is on the Shy Maid en route to Slaver's Bay. Dany is on the brink of war and being whisked away by Drogon. All of these stories conceivably to George at least, could have been resolved in a couple of chapters each. The Jon, Tyrion, and Dany stories would have been half as long as what we got. And this was for a summer of 2005 release date. Yes, George actually said that in February of 2005. He thought he could produce a no-split A Feast for Crows by the summer. That he could resolve Jon, Tyrion, and Dany in a couple hundred pages and have it all done. Which brings me to wins. At this point, it's been 14 years. We know there are problems. The delay is proof that there are problems. A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons together took 10 years to produce. If delay is evidence of problems, that means The Winds of Winter has bigger problems than A Dance with Dragons and A Feast for Crows ever did. And we know George has 2 crutches for getting through problems. More POVs and more material. But here's the thing. George has said that he's not going to put any new POVs in the Winds of Winter. Yes, he can change his mind. Originally, A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons were only going to have 2 new POVs, Cersei and Brienne, but George said this as recently as 2022, so it seems he hasn't been using this crutch, which leaves us with the other crutch, more material. At last report, which was October 2023 at Festival Bang, George said he had 1,100 pages.
The main thing I'm actually writing, of course, is the same thing. I wish I could write as fast as Bernard, but I'm 12 years late on this damn novel, and I'm struggling with it. You know, I have like 1,100 pages written, but I still have 100 more pages to go. It's a big mother of a book. For whatever reason, maybe I should have started writing smaller books when I began this, but...
So 1,100 pages means it's already longer than A Feast for Crows. And he also said, The Winds of Winter is going to be a big book. The way it's going, it could be bigger than A Storm of Swords and A Dance with Dragons, the longest book in this series to date. I do usually cut and trim once I finish, but I need to finish first. And so George fully admits that he's using the material crutch. The book is growing to a huge length, and yet the ending is nowhere in sight. Lengthwise, he has a book that's publishable, and yet he thinks he needs a book as big as A Dance with Dragons because he's nowhere near ending it. He feels he needs 400 more pages to wrap his story up. But we've been here before. Back with A Feast for Crows, he thought he could finish the no-split book in 200 pages. This was ridiculous self-confidence, but it's notable that this is lacking now. There is no confidence. Now, an optimist would say, hey, look at George's boom period. He wrote 500 pages in a single year. Couldn't he do that again and bring us the Winds of Winter? Well, anything's possible, but I'd like to show you something else. This is a chart I made showing when George wrote various parts of A Dance with Dragons. The cyan is stuff that was left over from Feast, the pink is stuff written in the boom period, the black is stuff written in the slow period, and nothing is attributed to the stalled period. Now obviously this chart is imperfect, as chapters are written, rewritten, broken apart, merged, moved around, and such. And explaining this chart in detail would be an entire video in and of itself. Maybe I'll do that in the future. But the only reason I'm even able to do this, especially the pink portion, is that George talked about his writing. He blogged about it, he spoke about it at conventions, and no more so than during the boom period. When George is on fire, he's excited about being on fire, and we hear about it. Seriously, his blog in 2010 is a fascinating read. But we don't have that today. There's no excitement about the Winds of Winter in his blog, there's no excitement about the Winds of Winter in his interviews. And we don't know what specifically is the problem. What characters, what plot lines are tripping him up? We just don't know. And he certainly doesn't have the same deadline like he did with A Dance with Dragons. A Dance with Dragons was finished just 10 days after the premiere of Game of Thrones. So that's the long answer. 2025? No, I don't think so. At least not based on history, and not based on anything that we see around us today. And if we do get wins, I fear it will bear the scars of it taking too long. Whatever problem plagued it will be in the text, just like with A Dance with Dragons. I sincerely hope I'm wrong. I really do. But thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.